stitch in the ditch is another great technique for completing any type of project, whether it be a quilt or a home deck item or a garment or even a handbag. The technique concept is to stitch basically what they call in the ditch, which is right along that seam edge, so that it in a sense is there, but you can't see it. I always think it's a good option for somebody that's starting out in quilting to start off with something like that. Proper setup is always key, and that proper setup is making sure that our needle sits in that 3.5 position, or that center needle position, because I think your eye has a better chance in this type of technique of following where that needle sits if it's centered. And then I always have my stitch length at about 3, and again we're on that straight stitch. The other thing that I find works best for me and will work best for you is to make sure that that needle is set to always stop in that down position. Now there are several feet that you can use for this technique, and we're going to start off with the standard presser foot. The other 2 feet are the open toe foot, which comes with the Jazz 2. And then the third foot is actually something, or a foot that's designed for stitch in the ditch technique. And that actually has, if we can take a look at it, a rail that sits right down the center, and that rail actually will ride in that seam. This is an optional foot. Now the basic principles are, I always make sure that when I'm aligning my needle, I want to align it along this ridge. Now all my seams are pressed to the side. I typically don't do this with a project that the seams are pressed open, because when you stitch down that seam, you run the possibility of opening that seam up or spreading that seam apart. So I use the edge of my seam, meaning I've got those seams pressed in one direction. I'm going to align my needle with that first seam so it just comes down over that ridge. And then I'm going to stitch down to the end. I'm going to stitch across because there's a ridge here, and then I'm going to stitch up. So when I was putting this block together, I alternated my seams so that they locked. I mean, alternating my seams, I alternated the direction I pressed them so they locked. So what I did was I created a path. If you don't have a path created, I always suggest taking a look at what you've pieced or what you've put together and find the best path to take for the stitch in the ditch technique. So you can kind of create one big long seam rather than, or long row stitching, rather than starting and stopping. You will find that you will be more successful if you have the opportunity to continue to sew rather than starting and stopping. Now I'm coming to the end, and I'm right at that junction point. I'm going to raise my presser foot, and I'm going to pivot, and then I'm going to come to this, down to this end. Now remember, you have the ability to take your needle up and take your needle down, and I often equate that to one stitch. So if you come to this point and you're a stitch short or a stitch shy, rather than put your foot on the foot pedal and run the risk of over stitching, I use the needle up, needle down, and I've taken that one stitch. So now I'm ready to pivot and then come back up this direction. Now if you look at my project, what I've done is I've added a little extra batting and fabric. What that allows me to do for this technique is to stitch off of this fabric edge, and we'll stitch off so that you can see how this works. So again, I'm stitching right along that ridge, and now I'm stitching off, okay? What I'm going to do is raise that presser foot, and this is where this type of technique is really ideal when you are using the knee lift. It makes it so much easier to raise and lower that presser foot, and I'm just stitching across, and I'll stitch to this point, and then I'm going to come back down. And it looks like I'm close. Rather than risk it, needle up, needle down, raise that, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come this direction. Now I would suggest when you're coming off of this fabric edge into the batting that you're a little closer than what I was there. I think I went a little too far. That just makes it a little more challenging to align my needle with this seam when I'm coming down this direction. So once I get to this end, we're going to stop, and we're actually going to change over to one of the other presser feet that you can use this technique with. So I'm going to just needle up and I'm going to clip my threads, and then this time I'm going to change over to the open toe foot. And remember, the feet are really easy to change. You just simply snap that foot off. Here's my open toe foot, and I'm going to snap that back on. So now what this did was this opened up a whole new world for me because I actually can see where everything sits. Another key thing when you use this type of stitch in the ditch technique is the fact that your seams are pressed. Pressing is really key when you are using this type of technique. Again, my needle is aligned up with that fabric edge, and I'm going to follow that down to the end, and I'm going to use that same turning technique of stopping at that point. And I'm going to chance it by just tapping that foot control, and then I'm going to pivot. Now it looks like I could probably take one stitch up, one stitch down, and now I'm ideal, and I'm ready to go. And then continue stitching down. Now as far as thread color goes, you may want to, or you might want to look at possibly something that blends with the background, or you could look at something like a monofilament or a clear thread. I do know that sometimes I have used quilting, a very light 80 weight quilting thread that's in a smoke color or white color, and that works ideal too. Here's the top, and I'm just going to stitch across that batting just like we did with the standard foot. And what that does, again, that creates that continuous line for me so that I don't break my rhythm. I always think it's about breaking that rhythm. And once we get down to the end here, we will change over to the stitch in the ditch foot. We're coming to the end. And if you want to lock your stitch, just go up and down a couple times. Take that needle out of the fabric. Raise the presser foot and clip those threads on the front and back. Toe foot, take that off, and we're going to attach the stitch in the ditch foot. Now again, that has that rail that rides down the center, and the goal of that rail is to butt up against that fabric edge. And what that does is that places that needle exactly where you need it for the stitch in the ditch technique. Okay, and I'm placing that rail right there on that seam, and now I'm going to start stitching down my fabric piece. Now, I will find that sometimes when I use the rail, I might have to just adjust my position of my needle ever so slightly, and when you do that, you want to make sure that your needle is out of the fabric so that you don't create a hole or possibly break the tip of the needle when you start to sew the next stitch. I'm at my corner, and again I'm going to pivot, and I'm going to come across, and now I'm ready to go down the side. Same principle, you're going to sew to the batting, raise that presser foot, and I'm just going to stitch down to this edge right here. Raise my presser foot, and I'm going to slide everything underneath, and I can see I'm not far enough. It's okay, that happens. And I'm aligned. Now, what I probably would have done if this were a real project, I would have basted along here to hold these pieces in place as I come into them. And there I go. I'm going to stitch this corner, and then I'm going to stitch up. And that's how stitch in the ditch is created. Is the goal again is to stitch in the seam so that that stitching is hidden on the front, but what it's doing on the back side is it is securing all three layers together. It's a quick and easy way to quilt something. Usually I like this on bags and table runners, placemats, because they get a lot of wear, so it's a really secure stitch. Again, you can use the optional stitch in the ditch foot. You can use the open toe foot that comes with the machine, and you can use the standard presser foot.